Namaste and welcome to Sundays with Kaivalyadhama. Sudhirji, namaste, and welcome. Thank you very much for your time and your presence and the wisdom that you share with us. Today we are streaming live from the Kaivalyadhama HCC library. This is the library that I remember coming to study when I did my yoga teacher's course. And what about you, Sudhirji? What are your memories of this library?
Well, this came much after I left here. I think this used to be a room. This is just an extension now. This wasn't there, but I've taught a few number of classes here with the 3-year Pranayam TTC course that we hold. So I'm familiar with this place, yes.
So today we are going to be discussing the do's and don'ts and obstructive factors and factors that aid in yoga practice. So without much ado, I will put the first question to Sudhirji. What type of form of yoga are we going to be discussing today in our conversation?
Okay, so as I always say, types of yoga is a misnomer, because when we look at yoga as a practice that is prevalent today, then inadvertently you go back to the yoga of Patanjali, Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali, which now is being called traditional yoga or Paramparik Yoga. So that's the only yoga I know besides Karma Yoga, Jnana Yoga, so on and so forth. But when we come to yoga as practice, yoga has been practiced today, then there's only one, which is Patanjali's yoga.
Thank you very much. There's so much, if I may say, conversations, discussions on the do's and don'ts of yoga. And in a way, sometimes some people find it restrictive. But I understand that there is a big importance, like last time you spoke about the formula. There's a formula for traditional yoga. And if you step out of that formula, it's not going to give you the kind of result that you want.
Yes.
So are there do's and don'ts and obstructive practices that could maybe deter a yoga practitioner? And also, are there positives of practices that a yoga practitioner could use to enhance yoga practice?
I think that's a very relevant question. And even before I address the question per se, I would like to step back a little bit. See, normally when we do conversations with students who have read a lot of texts, who have read a lot of books, like Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, or Hatha Yogic texts like Hatha Pradipika, Ghiran Samhita, Hatha Ratnavali. And a very common question that I find is, the text says that you can do retention 1-4-2. Why are you emphasizing on a gradual increase? Then people will come and say, the text says such and such, and you are just doing something different. Now, let me clarify. When we look at any yogic text, it applies in its entirety. So I'll just give you an example of pranayama, or for that matter, asanas. Now the question, why do you start gradually, whereas Hatha Pradipika starts with Kumbhaka, or Ghiran Samhita starts with 1-4-2, or some other schools start with Kumbhaka right on first day? So what I suggest to them is, yes, your point is relevant, but please don't forget, prior to these practices being recommended in the way they are recommended, are you following the do's and don'ts of yoga? Because if you are not following the do's and don'ts of yoga, then the results will not happen the way they are supposed to happen. A lot of times people come in and say, okay, I've been practicing asanas for 10 years, 15 years, pranayam for 15 years, and Patanjali says this, and Hatha Pradipika says this, and I am not getting the results. And I ask them, you're doing your yoga for 2 hours, 1 hour, what are you doing for the rest? And that's where the do's and don'ts become very relevant. Now, if you look at the do's and don'ts, you can trace them back to all of the Indian texts, people who are looking to progress in a spiritual life. But in regards to yoga, you can find these in the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. You can find it in the Hatha Yogic text, which in a way are just an extension of the Yoga Sutras. You can find them in Bhagavad Gita. So when we talk about do's and don'ts, they relate to our behavior, our diet, and our psychological attitudes and our lifestyles. And as we progress, then we'll touch upon them one by one.
Okay, wow. So basically we are looking at taking yoga off the mat into our daily lifestyle and imbibing the whole yogic philosophy into our eating, our sleeping, our movement,
Yes.
our relationships.
Yes. We are very right, because a lot of times people just see yoga under the prism of asanas. But yoga is not just that. Yes, it can be a tool, an instrument for spiritual development, but the principles of yoga also apply to our lives and our goals in life. I'll give you a small example. Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. He talks about Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna, Purvaka iteration. Shraddha means begins with faith, not religious faith, faith as an attitude, ends with devotion. So any task you do, anything you undertake, you have to have devotion. Virya, now literally it's translated as vigor. But virya also means positivity. There's no vigor possible without positivity. Smriti literally means memory. But you apply it to practice, it means momentum. And then you finally come to Samadhi Prajna. Now, Samadhi Prajna literally means awareness of the goal, awareness of Samadhi. In practical sense, it means composure, not being distracted. So now if you look at these principles, they not only apply to yoga, but you can apply them to our daily lives, thereby straightening our attitudes and ensuring that the outcome is the desired one. Even if it's not the desired one, we are not moved by an outcome that is not desired. So that is the application on the mat and off the mat. Off the mat recharges, stimulates, facilitates on the mat yoga.
So then, adding to this point of yours, so yoga is then more than just a series of stretches, a series of poses, a series of breathing, a series of meditation techniques. Yoga encompasses much more, if I may say so.
Yes.
Could you give us some more details on the specificity, or maybe some points on how large yoga is as a philosophy, as a practice, and how we can implement it in our lives, not only to be well, but to enhance performance?
See, before answering your question, we go to the basic premise of the Indian system of thought. The darshanas, Shat Darshan, plus you add 3 more to them, Buddhism, Jainism, and Charvak philosophy. Now, what is the underlying criterion? Because these philosophies are not merely intellectual in nature. The underlying theme being, Kimartham kriyate kriya. Why does a human being do what they do? Why do they do what they do? The answer being, sukhaya, dukkha mokshaya, eventually to be happy. Why do you do your practice? Why do you do your stretch? It makes you feel good. Eventually it makes you feel good. Even if you are weightlifting, for that moment you might suffer, but then you feel good. Even if you do cardio, you might feel good. You help someone. Why? Because you feel good. Now what comes in the way of us feeling good is the suffering. So now then from that point of view, one of the best definitions of yoga then you'll find in Bhagavad Gita. Tam vidya dukkha sanyogam viyogam yoga sannitam. Krishna says the real yoga is being disconnected with the suffering in our life. And that can only happen, as Patanjali says, yoga chitta vritti nirodha, by curtailing, by ensuring that our perception is clear. We perceive what we see. We perceive the way things are. Then he says, what is practice then? Tatra sthitau yatnyo bhyasaha. The endeavor that is undertaken to remove the suffering and to clean the dust of the mirror, so we perceive things the way they are. Now this endeavor is called practice according to Patanjali. Tatra sthitau yatnyo bhyasa. Now when you look at yoga, it's all about this. So applies to your life, applies to the practice per se, and this being the ultimate goal, to remove the suffering from a human being's life. And this goal is very practical in nature. You know, there's a spiritual goal of yoga too, but we will not talk about that, or we may talk about that as we go along, but primarily being to ensure that a human being is happy.
So, looking at the importance of living yoga off the mat or using the principles in our daily life. I mean, not that we're really busy, but everybody seems to be so busy. So what if somebody did a bit of yoga practice and not the ideal state of yoga practice, and if they tried to maybe imbibe or implement a few of the yoga philosophies into their life, would that still give them some benefit, or do they have to commit to a certain amount of time every day?
See, any practice will give benefit, but the underlying fact being, the underlying basis being the intent and the attitude. If the intent is there, if the devotion is there, Shraddha, Virya, Smriti, Samadhi, Prajna, if this is there, then the practice will definitely give results. Now, if you're doing the practice mechanically, then the practice will give mechanical results. Maybe your body will become strong, your body will look good, but ultimately it's peace of mind. So the attitude comes into play. Now, for example, I'll give you an example of an Upanishad called Kaivalyadhama. In Kaivalyadhama, Ashvalayana, he is a student, and he goes to a teacher and he says, "Teacher, teach me this knowledge of self-realization." What does the teacher say? This Shraddha, Bhakti, Dhyan, Yogat, Avaihi. He says, I cannot teach you. I can only take you up to a certain point. But with the wings of Shraddha and Bhakti, you soar and then glide into this reality. So these two, Shraddha is the quality of the mind. Bhakti is the quality of the heart. So you soar high with the wings of the mind and the heart, and then you glide into the peace, the goal, whatever goal you're seeking.
Beautiful.
Right?
So, as you mentioned, our main goal as humans is to be healthy and happy. And yoga is one of those tools that can help us get there. In fact, I correct myself, it's not a tool, it's a science. So how do we embody the science into our daily lives so we can move towards health and happiness?
Sure. See, the yogic practices, and I think I might have covered it somewhere, yogic practices, the real yogic practice, are the three final limbs of Ashtanga Yoga: Dharana, Dhyan, Samadhi. The first five are basically a preparation for the last three. However, the results that you get from the first five incidentally contribute towards our happiness. Now let's put it very simply. What comes in the way of our happiness? What brings discontent and unhappiness? It's not people or situations around us. It's not external. We might think external. We try to blame other people. We try to blame the situations. But it's not external. It is internal. Our perception is not clear. Now, what comes in the way of happiness and contentment and the feeling of well-being is our behaviors. See, if I'm not good with anyone, sometimes if I snap and I get angry, if I knowingly or unknowingly hurt someone, say if I'm jealous of someone and I act based on jealousy, for that moment, in that moment of passion, in that moment of rage, you might act and your ego might be satisfied. But in solitude, how do you feel? There's a vacuum. I should not have done that. That eats you up. So our behavior, your lifestyle for that matter. You're teaching yoga, you're doing yoga at 5 o'clock in the morning, and you party until 2 o'clock in the morning. Will that make you happy? It won't bring out the desired results. Then people have physical limitations. If your body is hurting, if the body is unstable, if the body is giving you pain and discontent, that becomes a problem. Now you're emotionally highly charged, you're emotionally active, you're emotionally, I would say, reactive. You become angry very fast, you become sensitive very fast. Now that's not going to give you happiness. You have negative thoughts in the mind always. Because you're not quiet, you're distracted. The mind is not quiet, it's bound to be distracted. Then you have to put that distraction back. And then negative thoughts are coming. Thoughts are not focused. Does that give you peace? No. Now, these being the source of happiness, how does yoga address them? Behaviors, lifestyle, yamas and niyamas. Body, asanas. Mind, pranayam. Distraction, pratyahar. Thinking, thoughts, intellect. The meditational techniques, which is a progressive. Now, please keep in mind, I'm not compartmentalizing these. These are body, mind, intellect, interdependent practices. So that is how yoga addresses the issue of happiness.
Lovely. So then, adding to this point of yours, so yoga is then more than just a series of stretches, a series of poses, a series of breathing, a series of meditation techniques. Yoga encompasses much more,
yes,
if I may say so.
Yes.
Could you give us some more details on the specificity or maybe some points on how large yoga is as a philosophy, as a practice, and how we can implement it in our lives, not only to be well, but to enhance performance?
See, before answering your question, we go to the basic premise of the Indian system of thought. The darshanas, Shat Darshan, plus you add three more to them, Buddhism, Jainism, and Charvak philosophy. Now, what is the underlying criterion? Because these philosophies are not merely intellectual in nature. The underlying theme being, Kimartham kriyate kriya. Why does a human being do what they do? Why do they do what they do? The answer being, Sukhaya dukkhamokshaya. Eventually to be happy. Why do you do your practice? Why do you do your stretch? It makes you feel good. Eventually it makes you feel good. Even if you're weightlifting, for that moment you might suffer, but then you feel good. Even if you do cardio, you might feel good. You help someone. Why? Because you feel good. Now what comes in the way of us feeling good is the suffering. So now, then from that point of view, one of the best definitions of yoga then you'll find in Bhagavad Gita. Tam vidya dukkha sanyogam viyogam yoga sannitam. Krishna says the real yoga is being disconnected with the suffering in our life. And that can only happen, as Patanjali says, yoga chitta vritti nirodha, by curtailing, by ensuring that our perception is clear. We perceive what we see. We perceive the way things are. Then he says, what is practice then? Tatra sthitau yatnyo bhyasaha. The endeavor that is undertaken to remove the suffering and to clean the dust of the mirror, so we perceive things the way they are. Now this endeavor is called practice according to Patanjali. Tatra sthitau yatnyo bhyasa. Now when you look at yoga, it's all about this. So applies to your life, applies to the practice per se, and this being the ultimate goal, to remove the suffering from a human being's life. And this goal is very practical in nature. You know, there's a spiritual goal of yoga too, but we will not talk about that, or we may talk about that as we go along, but primarily being to ensure that a human being is happy.
So thank you for sharing the factors that support and or obstruct yoga practice. That's a lot of information, and thank you for the clarity. Especially what I take back from this is the competitive aspect of being the best or enhancing your performance without being competitive. I think that's that balance that we need to find. And I would vouch for, if I may say, the theories or the do's and don'ts, because I find a direct relationship to enhancing my performance based on the do's and don'ts and living without the yoga principles in life. So coming to our last question, and maybe some tips for our viewers to take back with them on how can you help them with tips on how they can enhance their performance in life per se by using yoga and yoga practice.
So, it's a very good question again. Keep in mind the points that we have spoken about. They should be in the back of the mind of everyone. And when it comes to practice per se, if you already have a teacher, it's a good thing. It's very important, especially for practices like pranayama and meditative practice. That's number one. Number two, please ensure there is clarity with regards to practices, and whatever text you want to rely on. I personally prefer texts which are traditional in nature, because they are just a validation of what has been practiced for thousands of years. So try to gain clarity on why the practice is done. We don't want to go into even not too much depth, because sometimes it might take time, but get some clarity, get some sense of the practices. At the same time, now this clarity will lead you to a point where it will become clear to you. What time should I do my practice? Should my stomach be empty before I do practice? Should I keep eating and drinking while I do yogic practice? These are the things that will clear. Just to give you an example, they say yogic practices should be done empty stomach. You don't want to be creating a gym environment when you do yoga, because yoga asanas particularly are not acrobatics. They are practices of mindful body positions. So that's something to be kept in mind. And then one needs to practice with the right attitude. That is extremely important. When it comes to attitude, I would like to end by a quote I read somewhere. They say, when happy, don't make promises. When sad, don't make decisions. When angry, do not respond. And these eventually come with your practices. So this is what my suggestion
Beautiful.
would be.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Very
you.
profound words. Thank you very much. Have a great Sunday. Keep smiling. Be healthy. Be happy. And we'll see you again next Sunday.
Yes, thank you from a rainy Lonavala.
And please come and visit. The monsoons are here. The best part of the Indian seasons. I'm not sure if the people living abroad can experience this right now, but as soon as your air travel opens, please come along. We look forward to having you here. Namaste.
Thank you.